This week, freedom defined. What is freedom? What is America's ideal of freedom? How is Freemasonry involved in that? We'll read one Grand Commander's thoughts on the topic from March of 1977. Then we're going to attempt to put to bed that old notion that there were only 2 degrees in Masonry, or were there always 3 degrees in Masonry? Well, listen to this week's Masonic Myth Busters with Worshipful Brother Patric Dey. He's going to clear it all up and basically give us the tools we need to make the determination and to speak the facts when these topics come up in and around our Masonic circles. Then we'll take a brief travel through time as we look at our United States Constitution and one Scottish Rite Mason's thoughts and honorable judge's thoughts on the U.S. Constitution, the people behind it, and the progress this country has made. All this and more. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Whence Came You, a Masonic podcast featuring research papers and discussions related to Freemasonry. Here's your host, Brother Robert Johnson.
Welcome back to the show. This is episode number 691. As we get started, I want to thank our contributors, fellows, producers, and legacy partners of the WCY podcast. Without you, we can't make this show how we do and as often as we do. So I want to say thank you so much to those folks. If you are out there and you're curious on how you can help support the WCY podcast, head on over to our website, WCYpodcast.com, click on support the show, and check out the various options available to you. There is also other projects we are involved in, which is Skull and Crown Limited. Those are my leather works, as well as the shop. Anything you purchase through either one of those goes right back into this show and Masonic education. So thanks again for any consideration. Let's get into this week's education. I took a little break from the Clausen's letters that he would have published in the forefront of the New Age magazine, but I want to get back to it. Clausen always had a unique way of educating and inspiring the topics he chose to write about. And so because of that, I've chosen 2 pieces actually from the New Age magazine, March 1977. I'd like to read his introductory letter to that issue for the beginning of the show. Then we'll go into Worshipful Brother Patric Dey's Masonic Myth Busters, which is just going to blow your mind. And then we'll finish it up with a reading from that same issue about the concepts of freedom and Freemasonry. Let's get started. The Grand Commander's message: Freedom and Freemasonry. Freedom is fragile. The Athenians of the 5th century BCE saw this when their start toward a free society withered away. As Lord Acton observed, quote, "Their history, the Athenians' history that is, furnishes the classic example of the peril of democracy under conditions singularly favorable. They were the most religious of the Greeks. They venerated the constitution which had given them prosperity and equality and freedom. They tolerated considerable variety of opinion and great license of speech. They became the only people of antiquity that grew great by democratic institutions. But the possession of unlimited power which corrodes the conscience hardens the heart, and confounds the understanding of monarchs, exercised its demoralizing influence on the illustrious democracy of Athens." End quote. Recall in the connection the wise warning of our American patriot James Madison, quote, "There are more instances of the abridgment of the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachments of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpations." End quote. We who live in the United States many times take freedom for granted. It is, however, not a natural state. There are many sections of the world today in which you will find tyranny, slavery, and misery. For example, Freedom House, a non-profit corporation that commemorates Wendell Willkie, made a study that showed in the year 1975 there was a decline of freedom for 743 million people throughout the world, and that today only 19% of the world's population lives in freedom. The United Nations, numbering among its members some 144 countries, the great majority of these are iron-fisted dictatorships, one-man or one-family autocracies, with the inevitable state as master of the individual. Freemasonry cannot survive with safety in such a setting, for its enemies distort the meaning of Masonry, tending to create fear and hatred and to divert public opinion into a false direction. Masonry in its history, has been the victim of many unfair attacks. In some areas of the world, to paraphrase Shakespeare, slanderous tongues have done it to death. Often we have suffered in silence. Contend that, quote, "Be thou chaste, as is as pure as snow, thou shalt not escape calumny," end quote. Yet fairness and justice impel the observation that the charges made against Masonry are so far from reality as to be an outrage. They are a low blow. It is cruelty to those patriot Masons of America who were responsible for the pattern of civil and religious freedom we enjoy. At its worst, it smacks of the rapacious greed and the big lie technique with which dictators have confiscated the properties and imprisoned the leaders of the brethren abroad. We have every right to cry foul. Consider those who have persecuted Masonry, and then ask the question, why? One of the first acts of the Russian Bolsheviks in 1917, precursors to our present-day communists, was to dissolve all lodges. Belakoon in 1919 proclaimed the dictatorship of the proletariat in Hungary and ordered dissolution of all lodges. Spain's first dictator, General Primo de Rivera, abolished Freemasonry in 1925. Mussolini, who tried unsuccessfully more than once to join a Masonic lodge having established his regime, decreed in 1924 that no member of his fascist party could be a Mason, and proceeded in 1925 to exterminate the lodges and imprison the leaders. The Nazis, on Hitler's rise to power, dissolved Germany's Grand Lodges and sent prominent dignitaries to concentration camps. Gestapo agents seized the membership lists, looted the libraries and the collection of Masonic objects. Much of this was exhibited in a Munich anti-Masonic exposition that Goebbels started in 1937. This poured over into Austria, where masters of lodges were confined in notorious concentration camps, including the living hell of Dachau. Similar mistreatment was repeated on Hitler's takeovers of Czechoslovakia, Poland, Holland, Belgium, Norway, and Denmark. Nations subservient to Germany similarly were obliged to enact punitive laws against Masonry. Hitler's agents also infected the Far East until our victory when General MacArthur erased the prohibitory decrees. General Franco of Spain in 1940 sentenced all Masons in his nation automatically to 10 years in prison. When France fell, the Vichy government dissolved the lodges, seized their properties, and imprisoned the leaders. Misguided church hierarchies also have blasted forth bulls from time to time, trickily directed not against individuals but against the whole Masonic order, prompted primarily because the church leaders could not impose their political, social, and religious dictates upon the freedom-minded people. They considered the Masons a bar to their desire for domination. No wonder the bulls frequently have been coldly received or ignored. Mason baiting, therefore, has been the practice of the White Terrors, the Red Terrors, and the Black Terrors. The full sorrowful story includes murder, inquisitions, imprisonment, torture, looting of treasures and charities, and outlawing of organizations. Why? Why this fanatical hatred? Why this misdirected animus? The answer is simple. It is demonstrated in Masonry's history and purpose. Masonry is tolerant and universal, embracing all men and all religions with a belief in God. We therefore welcome, for example, a Christian or a Jew or a Buddhist or someone of the Islamic faith. There is no divisive dogma or creed. Many a member of the clergy who graced a pulpit has felt he was a better man and a better minister or priest because of his Masonry. They found in their lodges high religious ideals amid centers of enlightenment and good fellowship. For centuries, Masons have opposed intolerance and bigotry, spiritual despotism, and political tyranny. They have stood for integrity, for freedom, and for individual dignity. They refrain from meddling in politics. They believe in a divine power, in morality, and in a practice of charity, the teachings of which are derived in lodge meetings with similarly minded men. It is not a secret society. Its design, its object, its moral and religious tenets and humanitarian doctrines are as open and available as the obvious places where we meet. It is not a religion. It is dedicated to bringing about the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, and the making of better men in a better world, wiser men in a wiser world, happier men in a happier world. As individuals, enlightened Masons have advanced the cause of human progress and its reputation and its republican institutions. They laid the intellectual and the spiritual foundations of America. The authors of the great first encyclopedia, Deirdre d'Alembert, Condorcet, Helvetius, were Masons. When Benjamin Franklin went abroad as an envoy to France and met there with his brethren in Masonry, it was with moral strength gathered in Masonic lodges for individual action outside the lodges. Similarly, George Washington and his most trusted generals, and Alexander Hamilton, Robert Morris, Paul Revere, John Marshall, John Hancock, and many of the co-signers of the Declaration of Independence were Masonically so inspired. When Voltaire went to Paris, the year he died at 79, he was initiated into Freemasonry. The ceremony climaxed with Benjamin Franklin handing Voltaire the Masonic apron that the great Helvetius had worn. Voltaire then kissed the apron. As he did so, he must have remembered the hounding and killing of Masons, who met in the sewers of Paris just before the French Revolution in 1789. Masons historically have been in the forefront of movements that fired the imagination of freedom-loving people throughout the world. Goethe, Mozart, Lafayette were enthusiastic Masons, as were the great Hungarian hero of democracy, Kossuth, who found temporary refuge in America. Garibaldi was a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Mason and a Grand Master. Leaders of the Young Turkish Committee that in 1908 forced Sultan Hamid the Damned to give their nation a parliamentary form of government were Masons. In Latin America, the great liberators Bolivar, San Martin, Mitre, Alvear, Sarmiento, Juarez were active members who put into practice their Masonic humanitarian ideals. They were charged in lodges with teachings that enabled them to become individual champions of democratic progress and of religious and civil liberty. The hatred of Nazis, the fascists, and the communists was not merely emotional, it went deeper. The cleavage was a fundamental divergence of creed, namely the totalitarian super-racial state versus the Masonic ideal of equality and freedom, and the fulfillment of man's destiny as an individual. From, quote, the time whereof the memory of man runneth not to the contrary, end quote, Masonry always has championed the highest ideals of civilization. When permitted to flourish, those ideals have come nearest to realization and in a climate of the highest living standards. Conversely, when suppressed, the humanitarian ideals and freedoms and the welfare of the people have deteriorated. Perhaps we can best sweep away the rubbish of the anti-Masonic ravings with the words of the great Mason and guardian of American freedoms, the man who in 1793, while our first president wore a Masonic apron and laid the cornerstone of the nation's capital in Masonic ceremonies, George Washington. On August 22, 1790, he wrote this letter to King David's Lodge in Newport, Rhode Island, quote, being persuaded that a just application of the principles on which the Masonic fraternity is founded must be promotive of private virtue and public prosperity, I shall always be happy to advance the interests of the society and to be considered by them as a deserving brother, end quote. Today, our some 4 million Masons in the United States happily and proudly join in those sentiments. They number among them prominent statesmen, scientists, businessmen, artists, writers, clergymen, government officials, professional men, military men, rich men, poor men, lawyers, doctors, professors, mechanics, laborers, Democrats, Republicans, butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers, all strong exponents of American freedoms. We could list hundreds whose names, brilliant in the history and fame, adorn school streets and municipalities, the halls of our lawmakers, and the executive offices of our government. In this setting, the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry enjoys amazing success and popularity, at home and abroad, symbolizing to all peoples the ideals and principles of freedom, the independence from fear and archaic superstition, and serfdom, dynamic Masonic leadership and action, and the onward march of a free and wise and happy humanity. We proclaim in our Scottish Rite what we believe is right and true and honorable, and pay homage to our great national heritage and to the beneficent deity that gave us life. Consequently, since a lie never fit a fact, and facts are stubborn things, the attempts at Masonic baiting will never succeed. Long may our Masonry live and flourish in the free soil of a free world. Henry C. Clausen, Sovereign Grand Commander, The New Age, March 1977. Well, there you have this fantastic article. A couple of points to address. Number one, he said 4 million Masons. We've got less than 1 million today in the United States, but that only counts quote-unquote regular Masonic lodges. It does not include Prince Hall affiliate, which are regular, as well as a number of other Masonic organizations that are just unrecognized. We still may have 4 million Masons. I'm just not sure that they are all quote-unquote regular or recognized. Does that make them not Masons? That's a topic for another day. However, the other item in this I think is important to remember is that Henry C. Clausen uses both words of Republican values and Democratic values within the article. He doesn't give one or the other. Additionally, he uses the words, our great national heritage. To that, it is important to remember he is not speaking of things like manifest destiny or Americanism in terms of a sort of nationalist idea of westward expansion and, again, white heritage of America. That's not what he's referring to here. He is specifically referring to our great national heritage of the Masonic heritage of America, in that the ideals of this fraternity are the backbone of the cornerstone of this nation, the United States in particular. Next up, were there always 3 degrees in Masonry, or was it just 2 and we added 1? Well, we're going to learn right now. Let's check this out.
In a digital landscape filled with historical inaccuracy, out-of-context quotes on memes and sound bites, there is an epidemic of fraternal occult, mythological, and historical misinformation. It's time to set the record straight. Masonic Myth Busters with Patric Dey.
For centuries, Masons have been debating whether there were originally 2 or 3 degrees in Freemasonry. It would seem about every decade or so, the debate rears its ugly head again, and apparently no one remembers the previous time we all went over this. Now, here we are largely concerned with the number of degrees, though I will have something to say about the emergence of the Hieronymic drama later. Now, many Masons, even reputable Masons like Albert Pike, believe that there were originally 2 degrees, and then a 3rd degree was either added or the 2nd degree was split into 2 parts. Why? Why do they assert this? What caused this whole debate to start in the first place? And is it true that there were originally 2 degrees? I believe Albert Pike myopically and brilliantly sums up the origin of the number of degrees in his pamphlet Masonic Origins of 1887. Quote, "It is only known that until about a certain date there were no degrees, and that it was sometime after the first 2 were invented and used that the 3rd was adopted." End quote. Couldn't have said it better myself. Yes, at one time there were no degrees, and then later degrees emerge. Just like how in the beginning there was nothing and then God made something. Now Pike does believe there were originally 2 and then later the 3rd degree was added. Albert Mackey says something similar concerning his landmark number 2 of the division of symbolic masonry into 3 degrees. Quote, "Ancient craft masonry had no degrees. These were made about 1723. What do these guys mean when they say there were no degrees? How could there be no degrees? I think this comes from a very myopic reading of the old Masonic constitutions, which were produced by operative Mason guilds, in which the term degree is never used. William Hugan, in a letter to Lawrence N. Greenleaf, states the following, quote, "I have carefully perused all the known Masonic manuscripts from the 14th century to 1717, of which I have either seen the original or have certified copies, and have not been able to find any reference to 3 degrees." End quote. I believe Pike and Mackey are equally familiar with the old churches as Hugan, and they and others had likely noticed the total absence of the term degree or reference to 3 degrees. But of course the term degree would not be used by operative Mason guilds because that's not how they functioned. We need to remember that the guilds were an important incorporation of trade associations in the politico-economic system of early capitalism. The use of terms like apprentice, journeyman, and master were part of a set of conditions for being under contract or not, and whether you owned your own shop or not. If you are under contract to learn the trade from and work for a master, then you are an apprentice. If you have completed and are no longer under contract to apprentice for a master, you are a journeyman, or as the stonemasons preferred, a fellow of the craft. And if you are a journeyman who now owns your own shop and you yourself employ journeymen and take on contracts of apprenticeship, then you are a master. Masters could actually lose their title as master if they lose their shop and ability to hire journeymen and contract apprentices. I previously discussed this in a previous segment of Masonic Myth Busters, but this is an economic system, not a symbolic system of moral teachings. So, of course, they're not going to be using the term degree because it's not about advancing in education, but simply about being under contract or not. There are a number of Masonic scholars who have commented on the subject. Theodore S. Parvins, J.G. Fendel, J. Ramsden Riley, so many more. And all have chimed in at some point to weigh in that they do not believe there were degrees previous to the formation of the Grand Lodge of England, and that then there were only 1 or 2 degrees, and nearly all these authorities refuse to believe that there were 3 degrees prior to 1717. They are all men who have reviewed and studied old constitutions and Anderson's constitution, so why? Why is this their conviction? It would appear the debate completely and totally comes down to the peculiar wording of General Regulation number 13 in Anderson's Constitutions of the Freemasons of 1723. Now, to be clear, we know Anderson did not write the laws and regulations. Nonetheless, I'm just going to call it Anderson's Constitutions. So, General Regulation number 13 states, quote, "Apprentices must be admitted, masters and fellow crafts only here, unless by dispensation." End quote. Robert Freet Gould argues that "and" here, masters and fellow crafts, and here is synonymous with "or." And I mean, that's not unreasonable. As modern English was still trying to standardize itself, a lot of curious holdovers from Middle English lingered. For instance, if you read some of the old charges written in Middle English, you may notice that the word "an," A-N, is synonymous with "if." Why, I don't know. But some words that we today use in distinct ways were not so in early 18th century English, such as and or. So I don't think we can really fault Gould for reading things that way. However, Gould's impression is that the word master comes first, then fellowcraft, meaning the 2 titles were thus synonymous. Note that in the 1738 edition of the Constitutions, the order of words is changed. Quote, "Apprentices must be admitted fellow craft and masters only here," end quote. It would appear this ordering and peculiar choice of words had already caused confusion between 1723 and 1738 to merit such a change. So yes, basically, as far as I can tell, it all boils down to the absence of the term degree in old constitutions and this peculiar wording of General Regulation number 13. I'm serious. Literally, almost every author I have reviewed who discusses this matter, they largely circle around these 2 points, or they just point to an authority who then really just circles around these 2 points. Okay, so what evidence is there that there were 3 degrees from the beginning, apart from what I've already said about how the guilds were structured? We actually have an account from the 1700s attesting to there having always been 3 degrees, even before the Grand Lodges. This testimony comes from Dr. Thomas Manningham, who had been Deputy Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of England from 1752 to 1756. He had been in correspondence with Masons in Holland, who were inquiring of his opinion of the validity of various other degrees beyond the 3 degrees of ancient craft masonry. Dr. Manningham would refute these additional degrees and uphold the antiquity of the 3 degrees. His letter of July 12, 1757, which was discovered in the Grand Lodge of the Netherlands in The Hague in 1868, is worth quoting in full. So here we go. Quote, "These innovations are of very late years, and I believe the brethren will find a difficulty to produce a Mason acquainted with any such forms 20, nay 10 years. My own father has been a Mason these 50 years, and has been at lodges in Holland, France, and England. He knows none of these ceremonies. Grandmaster Payne, who succeeded Sir Christopher Wren, is a stranger to them, as is likewise one old brother of 90 who I conversed with lately. This brother assures me that he was made a Mason in his youth and has constantly frequented lodges until rendered incapable by his advanced age, and never heard or knew any other ceremonies or words than those used in general amongst us. Such forms were delivered to him, and those he has retained. As to Knights of the Sword, Eagle, etc., the knowledge of them never reached his ears until I informed him of them. The only orders that we know are 3, masters, fellowcrafts, and apprentices, and none of them ever arrive at the honor of knighthood by masonry." End quote. Thus, Dr. Manningham's father, Sir Richard Manningham, was made a Mason circa 1707, a decade before the Grand Lodge era began. Both father and son are certainly individuals of good report, along with George Payne, who actually passed a few months before this letter was written. There is some debate over the genuineness of this letter, largely as it concerns Manningham's claims about Sir Christopher Wren, but beyond that, most Masonic historians concur that the letter is genuine. Ultimately, this letter gives the attestation of 3 different individuals who were Masons before 1717. Their assurance to Manningham that all these other so-called higher degrees did not exist prior to 1717, and that the secrets communicated were the same then as 40 years later, and that there had always been 3 degrees: apprentice, fellowcraft, and master. Also, once again, I will point out that we know apprentices, journeymen, and masters were the 3 different statuses one could have in the operative guild system. Why would any of that change to 1 or 2 degrees upon the formation of symbolic lodges? Further, I'd like to point out that Masons are no different today than they were 300 years ago. So if you think Masons of 1717 would perfectly accept the addition of a 3rd degree and not openly and loudly complain about it, you must be kidding yourself. There would be evidence that a degree was added, and that evidence would be a lot of commentary of, "Back in my day, there were only 2 degrees, and when I was master, we only conferred 2 degrees." I'm just saying. The debate over the number of degrees that ensued through the 1880s and the 1890s, and again at the turn of the century, would ultimately yield to an agreement amongst most Masonic authorities that there were 3 degrees. One of these key pieces of evidence that emerged was the research and publication of the Records of the Whole Crafts and Fellowship of Masons by Edward Conder Jr., who was both a Freemason and a member and master in 1894 of the London Company of Masons, an incorporated organization of brick and stone masons that goes back to the operative guilds. They had existed for a long time, and since 1631, there was a speculative lodge attached to the guild, and Conder demonstrates that there had been 3 degrees as well as an old system of esotery. Okay, so there had always been 3 degrees. The evidence that there were originally 2 and then a 3rd was added is simply flimsy and supported by poor readings of old material, and that there is both historical attestation and operative Masonic systemization that there had always been 3. Alright, now let's switch gears. Maybe all this is a big misunderstanding, that really what is meant is that the Hieramic drama was invented after 1717 or thereabouts. Is the Hieramic drama evident by its antiquity as the number of degrees are? True, there is nothing resembling the Hieronymic drama in Anderson's Constitutions of 1723, but the revised 1738 edition does mention it. Certainly Anderson discusses Hiram Abiff in the 1723 edition, but nothing resembling the Hieronymic drama. But also note that Anderson's Constitutions does not mention anything resembling Noahide Masonry either. So bringing up this lack of Hieronymic legend being mentioned in the 1723 Constitutions is kind of a moot point. The first recorded mentioning of the Hieronymic drama is in Samuel Pritchard's Masonry Dissected of 1730, which is a Masonic expose or exposure, a Mason publishing information illicitly and against his obligations. Even so, the documentary evidence is that we first find Hieronymic Masonry in 1730, so naturally many have presumed that the legend of the death and burial of Hiram Abiff was invented sometime in this time frame. From what can be gathered from the old Masonic documents, catechisms, constitutions, legends, etc., is that the pre-1717 Masonic degrees largely centered around Noah and his sons and the Ark. Remnants of Noahide Masonry survive in the Royal Ark Mariner degree as practiced in England and preserved in the US with the Allied Masonic degrees, and there are some Noahic Masonic degrees in the Scottish Rite and others preserved in the Grand College of Rites. It's easy to presume that ancient craft masonry was Noahite, not Hieronymic whatsoever, just based on documentary evidence, what was written down. However, this is really not so clear-cut. So let's think of this another way, a thought experiment, if you will. Is it not entirely possible that Masons were really good about keeping their traps shut about the contents of their degrees, and that Hieronymic Masonry was what was predominantly practiced, and that Noahide Masonry was so new that they had to write it down to remember and keep track of these new changes? Could it not be possible that Hieronymic Masonry is the older form? So old and so long of a continuous tradition that it survived well as an oral tradition, not needing to be written down. It didn't need to be written down because it passed from mouth to ear for so long that if a brother forgot his line or what part came next, some old Mason on the sidelines knew the prompt to give him, as opposed to something so new that they needed to go look at the book. And that is why the first exposure that mentions the Hieronymic drama is not until 1730. It's just something to think about, because I do believe that we have been thinking about this all wrong. For far too long, Masons have been thinking of this based on the written evidence that survives, and not considering what an absence of evidence could mean. I also don't want to be outright dismissing the antiquity of the Hieronymic drama just because of a certain something. It's je ne sais quoi. There's just something about it that does not feel like it was invented whole cloth in the second quarter of the 18th century. It just does not feel like some dude or a few dudes just sat down and made it up. And this is looking at as it's described in early Masonic exposés. It flows organically from the miracle plays of St. Reinhold, the patron saint of stonemasons, and the dramatizations of Renaud de Montauban, of Merovingian chivalric legendary, both of whose lives resemble the Hieronymic drama. I may have to do a separate segment on this subject unto itself, and I probably will. Still, the Masonic legend of Hiram Abiff just feels like it's more fluidly a part of an older tradition of 17th century English theater, while the Noahic legend feels like a puzzle piece that's in the wrong puzzle box. Further, remember Dr. Manningham's brother of 90 years of age who, quote, never heard or knew any other ceremonies or words than those used in general amongst us. Such forms were delivered to him, and those he has retained, end quote. Yeah, that guy. To use this argument once again, do you really think a bunch of Masons are going to quietly let the ritual be drastically changed? Whenever I do the stair lecture, I always change this one little part deliberately, the part about the Romans contriving the Tuscan order. I always say the Etruscans invented the Tuscan. And still, every time I get an old-timer approach me afterwards to have a few words with me about modifying the ritual, even though the lecture's wrong, but still. And that's just one word. Imagine if we're going to change the ritual altogether. Hey guys, we're going to stop doing that Noah stuff and start doing this Hiram stuff. Here's an entirely new ritual to memorize. Good luck. There would be loads of evidence of Masons complaining about changes to the fraternity, and I'm sure we would have seen a schism much earlier than 1751. The whole notion that the Hiramic drama was invented whole cloth sometime between 1723 and 1730 just seems utterly preposterous. In conclusion, there was more evidence, and veritable evidence at that there had always been 3 degrees, not 2 that then became 3, and that Hiramic Masonry was likely always been practiced, not suddenly invented just because we don't see it written down. Again, lack of evidence is still evidence of something. The lack of complaints or dissensions or schisms likely indicates that it was just business as usual. No major changes, nothing to get upset about.
All right, how about that fantastic piece? I have often wondered about this, and I had heard stories from Brother Bob Cooper, the Grand Historian, or I should say the past Grand Historian of the Grand Lodge of Scotland. I'd heard stories from Masonic scholars all over the world in the Philalethes magazine, in AQC, in the Masonic Society, in the something I found of great interest is Patrick's notion of the, well, there's no other word for it, outrage that Masons have whenever something is attempted to be changed. So, one, the idea that we somehow added something and nobody had anything to say about it is very compelling in and of itself. The other is of that same argument in terms of the Noahite quote-unquote origins, or the first third degree. Maybe that was the new thing and we just never took it. Maybe it was a sort of movement against the sort of secularization of Masonry after the Duke of Sussex removed all of that religious connotation in the ritual. Maybe this was a way to sort of re-inject it in there by using a different allegory. Now, I'm not saying it's factually correct, but it is darn compelling when I think about that. Additionally, it just makes sense that if we mimicked those legal statuses of apprentice, Fellow of Craft, Master Mason, and Journeyman, respectively, to the Fellow Craft, that we would always have those 3 degrees. So, very interesting. I loved this. I've heard these points before, and I first heard of the pre-existence of the 3 degrees, having always existed, that is, a few years ago when I was speaking at a John Skeen conference up in Jersey, and I was at a hotel bar having a beer with Bob Cooper and a couple other New Jersey brothers. And Bob Cooper was educating me on this fact, this idea of the 3 degrees having always been existent. And that's when I started to change what I talked about when I talked about these degrees in the history of Masonry. And so since then, I've been much more objective in looking at the way we talk about the 3 degrees. My personal opinion, I think they've always been there. It just makes logical sense. But anyway, let's get on to this next piece, which I thought dovetailed very nicely with the Grand Commander's message. Again, this one is from the same issue and directly follows the Sovereign Grand Commander's message. It's called The Law, 200 Years in Perspective, by the Honorable William H. Stafford, Jr., 32nd degree KCCH, United States District Judge, Federal Building, Tallahassee, Florida. The criminal justice system, as we see it today, is an extension of the Anglo-Saxon system of law brought to the colonies by our forebears. Justice through law. With this heritage, then, why did the American Revolution occur? The striving for this justice through law is what brought about our revolution in the first place. Thus it was in 1776, thus it has been in the 200 years intervening, and for the millennium that will hopefully follow. Americans have struggled constantly for justice here at home and throughout the world. The best way our forebears knew to give life and meaning to this dream of justice was through law, and that magnificent Constitution they drafted in 1787 reflected their experience with injustice. They were determined to establish a government of laws, not of men, and they succeeded. In this 201st year of our republic, it seems appropriate to reflect on our stewardship of the many blessings given to us by those far-sighted men who, following the war, proceeded to frame a basic document for a new experience in government. A new system in which the government receives its only powers from the consent of the governed. There are many ways in which we can make an appraisal of how well this system has worked. We can and should take pride in the many accomplishments of our relatively new nation. We are the strongest, richest, and the most charitable nation on earth. Our citizens have more freedom than has ever been known in the history of civilization. Our public school system, while not perfect, has certainly provided each citizen with almost unlimited opportunity for all the education any of us could desire. And thus to be free of the illiteracy and ignorance still so prevalent in so much of the rest of the world, we care about our young, our old, and our sick, and manifest this concern through various programs, both public and private. We are free to worship according to our particular religious beliefs, or not to have any religion at all, absolutely without fear of government interference. The press and other forms of the media are free to criticize the government, and those in government without the bridle of government censorship. These are but a few of the many good things our system of government has provided. The important thing for us to remember, though, is that all this country is, has been, or will be is merely a reflection of what the citizens of this country want this country to be. It is well for us to remember the Constitution, that the Constitution, the basic document itself, did not become a reality until the state conventions ratified it. So, at the outset of the American people, themselves decided what kind of government they would have. Those wise men who drafted the framework for our system of government were also practical men who realized that all wisdom would not die with them. They built into the Constitution a method to change it when the people wanted it changed. In his farewell address to the nation in 1796, George Washington said, quote, "The basis of our political system is the right of the people to make and to alter their constitution of government." End quote. Thus, this noble experiment in self-government began with a built-in system for orderly change, and the new nation grew and prospered, welcoming new citizens from other lands, expanding its borders westward, developing a semi-industrialized and commercial economy in the north, with a primarily agricultural south. The new nation, experimenting with a unique system, weathered the death and destruction of a war between its own states and showed its willingness to make the changes to bring all men into full citizenship. But what of the women? In the 1890s, several states granted suffrage to women, and other states became more friendly to the cause. World War I required full cooperation from women, and in 1917, when the United States entered the war, a woman's suffrage amendment was submitted to the House of Representatives. On August 26, 1920, Amendment 19 became the law. The United States emerged from World War I as a great world power. Like many other countries, it suffered through a worldwide business depression but recovered to lead the free world to victory in a global struggle against the Axis powers, who, after enslaving their own people, sought to export their tyranny abroad. No sooner, it seemed, had our brave men and women returned from World War II when our international commitments sent them and their younger brothers and sisters to a faraway place to help a small country called South Korea maintain its freedom and independence from the communists invading from the north. As America continued to spread its influence over this planet and in space, the 50s and the 60s saw changes at home too. The words civil rights took on a different meaning. As various groups pressed for more rights, the system responded when the people who make up the system deemed the change was needed. We saw to it that the District of Columbia had a voice in the selection of the president and vice president with the adoption of the 23rd Amendment in 1961. The poll tax was abolished by the 24th Amendment, which became the law of the land in 1964. The young people of this country who, through the years, had contended that the nation which had so many times called them to fight its wars abroad should give them the right to vote at home, found their dream realized when the 26th Amendment was adopted on June 30th, 1971. This brief trip through American history is proof that our magnificent document, the Constitution, while giving this nation the stability it needs also provided the means to make the changes in our framework when the people felt those changes were needed. Our system of government and the freedoms guaranteed to all of us in the Constitution even protect the rights of those who criticize the system. It is well to ask these negative thinkers who seek to destroy our form of government, what do you have to substitute in its place? The silence is deafening, because with all its faults, there is no better system of government known to man than that of the United States. Chief Justice John Marshall observed in 1821, the people made the Constitution, and the people can unmake it. It is the creature of their own will, and lives only by their will. Each generation of Americans has had its own challenges and problems. The events of the past several years, while unique in our nation's history, have nevertheless been resolved with the framework of a system of laws. Many of these events might well have caused other nations to collapse, but the rule of law prevailed, and the nation survives. The greatness that has been, and is America, is that we have been able to resolve our conflicts and deal with our problems in an orderly society, governed by the rule of law. To preserve this system of government given to most of us as a birthright will require the support and devotion of all American citizens because, as Edmund Burke, the 18th century British statesman, so wisely observed, quote, all that is necessary for the triumph of evil in the world is that good men do nothing, end quote. We must not give up the fight, the stakes are too high, and the cause too great. As I read these articles today, I'm a fairly well-read individual. One of my favorite books of all time is Robert Anton Wilson's The Illuminatus Trilogy. Some of you know this, some of you are hearing it for the first time, some of you are thinking, what in the world is that? Robert Anton Wilson and Robert Shea wrote this three-part book. It is a really interesting book, and you'll find that most of your Masonic conspiracies come from that book that still live online. It's really interesting and kind of funny. It would be the modern version of a Leo Taxil, maybe. But anyway, Robert Anton Wilson was a sort of futurist, modern-day philosopher, if you will. He's since passed on. But something from his book I thought was really interesting was there's a series of characters, and all of them have like these political ideologies and things, and there's a lot of interesting stuff in that book. But anyway, the thing that I was going to say is that it reminded me of a quote from that book, and it said, freedom defined is freedom denied. I'll say that again. Freedom defined is freedom denied. And so I guess the phrase is pretty central to the trilogy of the theme of the entire book, which is questioning authority and the structures that govern our reality. This is something that Nietzsche does as well as a philosopher, but the quote really is this idea that it's a satirical commentary on how attempts to rigidly define and control freedom ultimately negate it. It suggests that when freedom is codified into laws or systems, it becomes a fixed and limited concept, thereby stripping away its true essence of boundless possibility and self-determination. So just something to think about. We ride these lines, and it makes it very important to think about as we codify what we believe to be objectively right and codify in our system of laws and government. Anyway, just something to think about. Once more, I want to thank our producers, fellows, contributors, and legacy partners of the show. If it sounds interesting and you want to check it out and see how you can help support Masonic education through this podcast, head on over to our website, wcypodcast.com, click on Support the Show, and check out the options there. Additionally, if you like everyday carry, handmade leather goods, check out my Skull and Crown Limited. You can send me a message. I'm pretty responsive on there. If there's something I can do for you, I can make you custom, whatever it is, let me know. In addition to anything you see there, pretty much everything's on the table. I have some standard items that I can always make pretty quick for folks, but in general, most things are made when you order them. So just know that everything's handmade, hand cut, burnished, all that stuff by me. So it takes a little time, but I do appreciate it. And again, all proceeds from that go right back into fundraising for the program. Same with our shop where you can get a pin or autographed books, all that. So with all that said, thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you all next week. And until then, stay on the level. For Whence Came You, I'm Robert Johnson. Take care. Stay free.
You've been listening to Whence Came You, a Masonic podcast featuring research papers and discussions related to Freemasonry with your host, Brother Robert Johnson. Be sure to join us for our next edition.
WCY Media.
Well, you guys beat me as wrong.